you so much. So you can see the title on the slide. I have a lot of slides here. I just want everyone to know that. Some of the slides I may go a little quick over, but you're going to have them. You can study them later. My email contact is at the end, so if you have questions or comments or feedback, you can certainly provide that. Um, so let's just jump into this. Oh, maybe I should give a bit about myself. I served in the military for 33 years. I started off my military career as an 11 Bravo infantryman, became an officer. As you can see on this slide, I retired a colonel. I am now a tenured professor at the University of Southern California, and I've been there for about 12 years. So I'm an old guy. I'm an old person. Um, but I think hopefully I'm not so old that I'm not open to new ideas. In fact, I'm going to present some new ideas to you today. And some of you may like these new ideas. Some of these, what I say, may challenge your thinking. I don't think I'm going to say anything controversial. So let me just say that up front. If I do, I apologize up front for that. The intent is not to be controversial, but it is to be thought provoking. So let's jump into this. So here are the lecture goals. I'm not going to go over the lecture goals. You can read those later. However, there will be knowledge checks and exercises throughout the presentation that we'll do together. Mary mentioned there's some questions that you have to get right. We're going to go over those questions and the answers. So don't anybody panic about that. This is my military training. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So I'm going to use that sort of military mode of instruction. So any of you who've been in the military are familiar with these. Oh yeah, I get that. I get that. But I'll try not to be too repetitive. Okay, so here's the agenda for the presentation. I'm going to briefly review some current definitions of moral injury. I'm going to show you the foundational literature for that. And then I'm going to give you a new definition, and I'll try to, present the rationale for why I think we need to do a new definition of moral injury. We're going to talk about the continuum of moral injury that came out of this new theory that I developed along with my colleagues. We're going to talk about the dual process model. That one you may be maybe bored about, so maybe I'll go with that a little bit quicker. It's sort of at the end when people sort of get fatigued anyway. But I'm going to talk about the clinical implications and the work implications, as well as linking moral injury to dying by suicide. So that's the agenda. I think we can do that in 2 hours. There'll be no break. But as Mary said, I will, when we get to our sort of knowledge checks and exercises, we can open up the mics and people can ask questions. It's more important for me to hear what you think and answer your questions than to me to get through every slide. Okay, so I just want you to know that. So, when I talk theory, most people's ears flap shut. They stop listening. They go, theory, schmeary. I don't want to hear about theory. I got a job to do. I want to solve problems. Why do I need to know theory? Well, theory is important for a lot of reasons. So I'm just going to lay it out here. Theory tells us what are the things that we should be paying attention to. What is important both clinically and non-clinically? So you don't even have to be a clinician. Be a non-clinician and appreciate this. But more importantly, it makes predictions about the relationships of those things that we say we're interested in. And it identifies points of intervention. If you don't have a theory that tells you where to intervene, we'll just be intervening willy-nilly and hoping we get it right. And I'm going to make the point that's really what we've been doing in the suicide arena and other arenas too. And it's why we've made very little progress despite lots of resources and lots of people's passion about ending deaths by suicide. But I would argue it's because we lack a really good theory of what's causing suicides. So I'll give that as an example. Also, good theory will transcend cultures, contexts, eras, national militaries, and professions. So if we have a good theory, it should apply in the military, it should apply in nursing, it should apply in dentistry, it should apply in social work, it should apply for lawyers, it should provide for all healthcare professionals, etc. If you have a good theory. Otherwise, you have to develop a theory for each profession. And so this is why theory is important and why I spend a lot of time developing theories, thinking about theories, testing theories, because we want to make sure that our interventions, things that we do, are useful, that'll work, that will solve the problems that many of us are interested in addressing. So moral injury really began with the work of Jonathan Shea. And here's a picture of him here. He's now retired, but he was a psychiatrist who worked in the Boston VA. And in a series of focus groups that he was leading with Vietnam veterans, he realized that veterans were suffering from something that psychiatry and psychology hadn't properly defined. And he wrote this book, Achilles in Vietnam. It's a classic in psychiatry. It's a classic in behavioral health. It's a classic in mental health. So it's a classic in PTSD research. So if anyone is interested in any of those topics, this is a classic book. And what he did is he took what the Vietnam veterans were telling him, and he goes, I remember in my classical studies, Greece, that Achilles was describing exactly the same thing in his experiences with the Trojan Wars and all the wars that he fought in ancient Greece. These reactions that veterans are having coming back from combat have been recorded since mankind began recording their experiences of combat. And this quote here comes from his preface when he talks about when a veteran says he lost it, what did he lose? What did Achilles lose? I believe that the veterans and Homer shared similar views on this subject. In the veterans' own words, they lost their humanity. And you can see the title of his book is Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. And we're going to return to this theme of character in our definition and in our theory and conceptualization of moral injury. Now, there are lots of definitions of moral injury that various folks have offered. Jonathan Shea's definition is a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. So you can think of this definition as things that someone in authority does to you. And we see a lot of these parallels with in organizational the literature where leaders of organizations don't support their subordinates in the way that subordinates feel they should be supported, and this can lead to burnout, perceptions of betrayal, etc. Brett Litz and his colleagues defined moral injury as the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, and social impact of perpetrating or failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about the acts of transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So Brett Litz is a clinical psychologist, also at the Boston VA. And this is a very diagnostic definition, and it's also a very psychological definition. So oftentimes people who define these words, you can see the profession they come from. Now, Brock and Latini were chaplains, so they were clergy, and they define moral injury as a wound in the soul, an inner conflict based on moral evaluations of having inflicted or caused some harm. And then I'm not going to read the rest of it. You can read it for yourself, but you can see they give you a spiritual definition, which is what one would expect from chaplains, or not unexpected. Let me say it that way. But what they don't really answer, none of these definitions really answer, why would betrayal or moral transgressions or an inner conflict based on moral evaluations cause an injury? Why would that cause an injury? And what we will argue and what you will see is we will argue because it's a threat to one's sense of self, how one sees themselves as a person and how they want other people to see them. So, and we're going to develop that theme throughout. So the foundation literature for our new theory, of course, begins in the virtue ethics, all the way back to the Greeks. You saw Homer and the Iliad, and we start with Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. So this is the foundations for ethics and virtues. And the Stoics is a philosophy, and I'll just touch on it briefly later, but basically the Stoic philosophy is how you live a good life is to live a virtuous life. Be as good a person as you can possibly be. And they have lots of things of what that looks like and how you can do that. But the idea is that to live a good life, you live a virtuous life. And these papers here, and I'll refer back to them later, but these are the papers that we published with our new theory, and we're constantly publishing lots and lots of papers. I just selected the key ones that deal with the theoretical aspects of our new theory of moral injury and the dual process model. So you can look those up and read them at your leisure. But I just want to highlight all of what I'm saying has been subjective to the scientific peer review process. And for those of you who understand that, you know this is how people critique your ideas. They say, well, this is a terrible idea, or have you thought of this? And we sort of made that gate. Doesn't mean this theory is perfect, right? So one of the things that we know about all theories are wrong. Some are useful. Okay, so this is an old adage that people say, and we think that this theory will move us forward in our understanding of the impact that moral injuries can have on the psychological and physical well-being of individuals. So when we talk about virtues and character, where do we get our virtues? Where do we get our character? Where does that come from? Well, this is this list on the right are examples of what I call military virtues. I wrote this paper, gosh, I guess 26 years ago. I'm dating myself, where I talk about what I consider the key military virtues at the individual level, at the leader level, and at the organizational level. And of course, this is very much oriented towards the military. But almost every organization in America, even corporations, will say these are our values. It might be customer service, it might be patient satisfaction. You know, if you're at a hospital or if you're at Walmart, or you go to their website, they'll say, what are your values? And it could be making money, it could be, you know, sort of making profit, giving value to our shareholders, or those kinds of things. But our character comes from lots of different places, right? And the main place where we get our values, we get our character, is from our family and society. But we also get it from school. We get it from religious institutions. And if you're in the military, you get it from military institution. Every military service in the world has a set of values. Every one of them does. The U.S. military values, each service has values, and those values differ. But now every service, by the way, every service now has courage as a value. The Air Force was the last one to add courage. I might add that as their values. But I think now the Air Force has the most comprehensive values-based approach of all the services. In the past, I would have said the Army does, but the Air Force passed this up. But every service has values that differ. Okay. By the way, none of them have intellect or subordination as a value, but I'll talk to you later about why I think those are important at the individual level. But leaders, everybody wants leaders that they can trust, leaders that are fair, leaders that are responsible for their actions. And at the organizational level, if you're in the military, I want a military who values victory, right? The military's mission is to fight and win our nation's wars. So victory should be something that they value. Leadership is something that the military has to value, because every leader in the military starts off as a private or a second lieutenant or the equivalent from the services. We don't have ads in the military where they say wanted, 1 4-star general to lead the U.S. Army. They have to come up through the organization. So that requires a leadership development focus that a lot of organizations don't have, because you can just poach and hire from other organizations. Military doesn't do that. So it's a unique type of system. The church is like that too. You know, the Catholic Church, I don't think when we got a new pope, I don't think there was an ad put out, right, in LinkedIn saying, looking for one pope to lead all the Roman Catholics around the world. No, they were picking from someone who went up through the organization. By the way, academics do the same thing. And one of the three things that all of these professions have in common, they're all medieval institutions: the military, the clergy, and education. All medieval institutions. So they're all very insular, and they come up within all of their leaders come within the organization. Can you imagine, like, you couldn't be the CEO of Walmart unless you started off as a floor manager or a stock boy or someone who, started off in, ringing up cashiers, so you can imagine that would be a very different culture if everyone had to come up from the bottom. So that's a very important aspect, but a very different aspect. But what I'm going to talk about with moral injury applies to all professions, and virtues apply to all professions. It's just how they vary and how they differ. So sometimes people will talk about the different roles they have. Said differently, the various identities you have. Everyone has their sort of personal identity. They have their social identity. One time I had a very, very strong military identity. I was a colonel. I had a colonel identity, but now I'm a professor. So now I had to move and change my identity from being a colonel and expecting everybody to be on time. And if they weren't on time, I'd yell at them, to just accepting people are late. Life happens. Not everyone can be on time. You got to let things go that don't matter. And we have this social identity. In the military, we want to be courageous, right? And we have this role as a parent. I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a granddad, right? We have all of these different roles and all these different identities, but it's still me. It's still the same person. So the Greeks talked about this character and these distinctive marks that mark you, who you are and what you stand for and what you believe in. So William James defined character in this very, very, I think, insightful way. So for those of you who don't know, William James is the father of modern psychology. And he wrote this letter to Alice Gibbons, who's a close family friend. Said, I often thought that the best way to define a man's character would be to seek out that particular mental or moral attitude in which, when it came upon him, he felt himself most deeply and intensely active and alive. So what moves you when you say, that's me? I'm a colonel. I'm a professor. And when you make these transitions, you point, well, I've never been a professor. What does that mean? And also you say, okay, I get this now. That's who I am. At such moments, there's this voice inside which speaks, this is the real me. So everyone goes through this moment. I mean, we all go through this sort of life. Why am I here? What's my purpose in life? I think we all do that around high school, first or second year in college. But you have to think about, we change professions and we change our identities throughout our lifetime if you're willing to learn and grow and develop, right? And most organizations appreciate the importance of growing and developing. That's why many of you are here for CEU credits. And they make it a requirement. Why? Because some people don't do that. Some people, if they didn't have to do CEU credits, they'd never do any CEU credits, right? Because they can be expensive, but these are free, right? But they can be expensive, they're time consuming, but you got to do some CEU. You got to stay current on something, okay? So that's what organizations do, right? They emphasize the need to continually grow and learn and develop, okay? So now, what is our definition of moral injury? So oftentimes we say, what's in between moral injury and PTSD? So there's a whole debate in the field still whether or not a moral injury is separate and distinct, or whether or not it's just a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. So you're not going to find this definition where I made up this definition of PTSD. Like I'm talking to my mother, she says, what is this PTSD stuff? I'm not going to give her some long-falutin psychological, psychiatric definition, but this is what it is. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health problem. Okay, it's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders that some people develop after experiencing or witnessing a life-threatening event like combat, a natural disaster, a car accident, or sexual assault. And that's kind of a wrong one-sentence definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Moral injury, how we define it in our theory, is moral injuries is a perceived personal failure. The perception is on the part of the individual that they perceive that they have failed. to adhere to a virtue or value that often results in needless suffering or death that threatens one's identity and character. Okay, so it's, why did I do that? What kind of person stands by and watches these kinds of things happen without speaking up? Okay, that things like that can begin to impinge on who you think you are. Do you speak up when you see something wrong happening? If a colleague is being unfairly blamed or bullied by their supervisor or another colleague, do you speak up or you just stay silent and mind your own business? I grew up, my mother told me, mind your own business. In the military, they're saying to stay in your lane. That doesn't concern you, you stay in your lane. But at some point, you reach high enough in the organization where it's incumbent upon you to speak up anytime you see something happening that's not fair, that's not right. And how do we define what's fair and what's right? Well, I just talked about where we get that sense of what's fair, what's right, what's just. Okay, I would argue anytime you see someone's life in jeopardy, anytime you see unnecessary suffering, you're obligated as a human being to speak up. You're obligated to speak up. Now, I was talking to a colleague the other day. He was really upset. They painted a wall a really ugly yellow, and he was really angry about it. And I just said, who cares about that? Other than our sense of aesthetics is violated, nobody dies and nobody is suffering, right? Other things to worry about. By the way, this is a Stoic belief type system too. So you'll see I have a lot of very strong Stoic beliefs. So let me just, before I go any further, really introduce this concept of sense of self. So sense of self has many components. But as I said, we define moral injury as a moral failure occurring when an event or experience challenges one's sense of self. So a sense of self obviously has many elements. These are three elements that I identify. By the way, I adapted this model from Amy Price, who's done a lot of real good thinking on sense of self, but knowing who you are despite personal failures and setbacks. In science, I submit grant proposals, I submit research proposals all the time. Sometimes they're rejected. I'm told it's a bad idea, but I know a good idea when I see it. And sometimes, good ideas can be too early in the process. So you have to circle back. If it was a good idea yesterday, it'll be a good idea 2 or 3 years from now. Okay. And if it's not, then it probably wasn't a good idea. Feeling good about yourself. How do you feel about yourself? Clinically, I always ask my clients, how do you feel about you? Do you feel good about who you are, where you're at in life? Right? Then striving to be a better person, living a virtuous life. We're human beings. We're going to make mistakes. The question is, what do we do when a mistake happens? Do we get defensive, blame somebody else, or do we accept responsibility for the mistake we made and then try to do better next time? Maintaining a belief in yourself despite what others may say or think. This is really hard to do because we all like this social feedback. Like my wife at the end of this workshop will say, well, how did it go? And I'll probably say, oh, well, it went very well, because only the people who like the talk will write nice comments. Very few people say, what a terrible job Castro did. They usually don't put that in the comments or tell it to me. So I get a very biased feedback, right? My feedback will be very biased. But this is your sense of self, right? Self-knowledge, stable under pressure, positive sense of self, positive self-worth. Okay, and that's hard because sometimes we are our worst critics. We'll run ourselves down with negative thinking, right? In psychology, we say, stop the negative thinking. How to stop negative? That was a Stoic concept, by the way. And a lot of people who develop cognitive behavior therapy, like Beck and all those guys, they say, I just took what the Stoics said and put it in a clinical framework. So this is how powerful Stoicism can be. Coaches in the military love Stoicism. Why? Because it focuses on the future. And it also says, don't dwell on things we have no control over. So in sports, the referees, they cheated us. Coaches don't want to hear that. Focus on things you can control. Can't control what the referees are going to do. Let's focus on what we can do. And when you have a setback, and let's face it, in sports, teams lose all the time. You can't be dwelling on the loss you had last week or 2 weeks ago. You got to prepare for the next game. Okay, so that's the stoic mentality. Focus on success in the future. Don't be dwelling on the past, because the past is over. We can't control it, and there's nothing we can do about it. Let's put all of our energy in being better, being prepared for the next game. That's a stoic belief. And it's very powerful in sports, in the military, where there are setbacks. Bad things happen in the military. You lose in sports. So any occupation in science, not every paper gets accepted right away. Not every grant is funded. You can't dwell on that. You got to work on the next grant. Okay, you go forget about that. Learn, but then move on. So lots of professions are impacted by moral injury. This is just a short list, but military service members, the concept of moral injury came out of the military, but it's not the only profession impacted. Healthcare workers, huge impact. Social workers, aid workers, journalists and lawyers who will see things. Lawyers who have to defend people who they know are guilty. That has to have an impact on who they are. Like, what kind of person am I, where I help get a guilt? I know they're guilty, but I try to get them off. And sometimes they're successful in getting them off. Okay? Therapists, human rights workers, police officers, firefighters. I mean, the list is almost endless. There's nothing unique about a moral injury having a sense of personal failure that can result in needless suffering or death that impacts who you are. Okay, so I'm not going to go into each one of these and what it looks like, but I just want to give you a flavor. Don't leave here thinking only the military can have a moral injury. There are some people who will say that. Well, moral injury is unique to the military. No, it's not. All these professions are at risk. So to recap, moral injury remains an elusive concept, yet it potentially impacts the lives of many professions. I hope I made that point. Many of the definitions are vague, right? They don't tell us why a violation of deeply held belief matters. And some are circular. I didn't go into that, but a lot of these definitions use the word moral in their definition of moral injury. And I think we learn what in 4th or 5th grade? You don't define a term by using that term in the definition. That's like a violation of a good definition. All those definitions above, except Jonathan Shay's, do that, right? They're circular. I said, come on, we learned not to do this in 4th or 5th grade, I think, something like that. So we get away from the circularity, define moral injury without using the word moral or injury, right? That's the goal. The foundation for understanding morals is the virtues we hold to be the most important in defining who we see ourselves as. Virtues represent the bedrock of character, okay? Virtues are really important. I know people, virtues, what's that got to do? Character matters. I know a lot of people don't think character matters. To me, character matters. That's a belief, but there's data that shows character matters. Ethical markings are stamped on numerous identities. So our character is influenced by all the identities that we hold. Okay, so my identity, I have no identity, for example, of being a female or a woman. I have no idea what that's like. I try to sympathize and understand, but I could never claim to, I get what you're going through. No, I could have no idea. Okay, I could have no idea. And there's lots of examples of that, race, ethnicity, sort of things that really we can't control, but it shapes who we are. Okay, so let's do a knowledge check, and you might see these later. So we'll spend a bit of time on these. So I'm going to read these. Normally I would have somebody online read them, but I'll just read them just for time purposes. So the credit for introducing moral injury as a significant issue confronting many different occupations belongs to A. Castro, a former infantryman who is now a professor at the University of Southern California. B. Achilles, a soldier stationed at Fort Bragg. C. Litz, a psychologist who works at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Boston. Or D. Shea, a psychiatrist at the Boston VA who worked with Vietnam veterans. So just in chat, just type, well, you don't even have to type your answer if you don't want to embarrass yourself. What do we think the answer is? Think about that. What do you think the answer is? The answer is D. Shea, right? Jonathan Shea, his Achilles in Vietnam, he was the one who introduced this concept of moral injury. 2, the definition of moral injury that is based on the character states a moral injury is a mental health problem. B is a perceived personal failure that threatens one's identity. C, trauma must be present for there to be a moral injury. Or D, has been well validated as a useful definition. Okay, the answer there is B. Okay, moral injury is not necessarily a mental health problem. I'll talk about that in more detail. Trauma does not have to be present for there to be a moral injury. I'll give some examples of that. And D, it's not a well-defined definition, even though I think we gave a well-defined, useful definition. I think it's not validated and all of that. Okay, that's kind of a tricky question. 3, moral injury was first described in veterans because A, only combat veterans can have a moral injury. B, combat veterans were showing symptoms that have never been seen before. C, veterans are more self-reflective than those who have never served. Or D, none of the above. What do we think? I should be looking at the comments. What am I doing here? Let me hop over in the chat and see people are putting in some answers. Okay, what do we think the answer is here? Okay. For some reason, I'm supposed to say got it. Okay. So the answer here is B. Combat veterans are showing symptoms that have never been seen before. But we know they've been seen before, so if you put B or D, I would accept either of those answers. B or D, either one of those would be good. Finally, William James, the founder of, the founder of modern psychology defined character as being true to oneself, one who doesn't have a moral injury, someone who lives a virtuous life, or D, the moment one realizes what makes them feel most alive. So D, right? What makes you feel most alive? That's how William James defined it. Okay. So I hope you found the knowledge check sort of reflective. They're tough. They're tough questions. It's really to get you to think about the issues a little bit more. So now let's jump into moral injury, moral character, and then really the moral failure continuum. I want to spend most time on that. Again, I've already talked about, we published these articles. This is where you can find them. There are other articles being written that are in progress. That's not really the most important thing. But let's start with Aristotle. So Aristotle talks about what he calls misfortunes, right? Misfortunes occur when a person is at the receiving end of a mistake, right? Or a victim of a vicious act or a misadventure, okay? So this is sort of where Jonathan Shea was coming from, where the leaders put their subordinates in an untenable position. Vietnam, in healthcare, hospital administrators don't give the healthcare workers the resources they need to properly do their job, as an example. These are just examples. Okay, and then there are other examples where you're victims. And you can look at these and you say, oh yeah, all of these can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, other mental health disorders, and behavioral health issues, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, discrimination, etc. This is not an exhaustive list. Okay, this is why oftentimes moral injury gets confounded with post-traumatic stress disorder, because there's the same event can cause multiple things. Self-inflicted injury that occurs when there seems to be an imbalance between the rational and the irrational parts of the soul. So here you can see Aristotle's talking about the soul, and this is why sort of chaplains gravitate to this concept of moral injury as well, because, their sort of, goal in life, I always say, like, what is if you're going to measure an effective preacher or an effective priest or an effective rabbi, what would it be? Well, how many people get to heaven? Isn't that the goal of a preacher, helping people get to heaven? So wouldn't that be a great outcome? But how would you know, right? They don't send you a note back and say, hey, I made it. Thanks for the help, right? So they do other measures of it. Did you come to church? Those kinds of things. But keep in mind that we do have this sense of self, the sense that I'm in my body and not in somebody else's body, right? This is sort of how sometimes people define soul. But it's, I think, an important concept. Now, Aristotle also said it's difficult to do the right thing all the time. We often make a mistake, right? We miss the mark. We're human beings. We make mistakes, right? Nobody's perfect. Despite claims that some people might say, I've never made an error. I've never made an error. In reading the Bible, I think there was only one perfect person in the whole recorded history. So perfect, taken to heaven because this person was perfect. All right. So there are examples, one that I'm aware of in religion or in mythology where that's happened. So the question then becomes, is moral injury the only type of moral failure? What happens to character when people experience moral failure? And more importantly, is moral injury being defined in a way that is meaningful? We kind of already answered this last question earlier, but I'm going to dwell on the first two questions. Just to remind you again, I'm not going to read these. The distinction between PTSD and moral injury. Moral injury is not a mental health disorder, okay, in our definition. Okay, in our definition, moral injury is not a mental health disorder. It may be so severe that it requires professional help because it can lead to impairment. But oftentimes, these moral failures don't require any intervention or maybe mentoring or coaching. So when we talk about character, we talk about two things that happen that change one's character: a just and an unjust outcome. When there's a delta between that, there's a difference between what is just and what is unjust. We would always say that if you have kids, that's not fair, right? Those are the things kids say. That's what they're talking about. This isn't fair. And then when you're true to yourself, what you think is the true self, when you behave in a way that's true to who you think you are, versus when you behave in a way that's not true to who you think you are. Okay. And this is a formula that you can get in the literature. We've modified it slightly and you could sort of calculate these things. That's not the important point here. The important point here is the third point. Character change will have related effects on the integrity of your identity and your sense of self. So as you grow in character, you're going to get a stronger sense of who you are, what's important to you, and what you stand for. In the military, and I think I've heard this in academia, is that the sword you want to fall on? How important is that to you? Do you want to risk your career for this? Would I risk my career over being upset about what color the wall was painted? No, that would be silly, in my opinion. That would be silly, right? But if I see people dying or huge suffering needlessly, yeah, I should speak up. That's something that I would risk my career for. And it's easier to risk your career when you're older. Let me just be very candid about that. When you're older, near retirement, you're willing to do things that you normally wouldn't do. Okay. And you can see that on social media too. People follow me and say, yeah, you're only saying that because you're retired. Right. And oftentimes people will make these parting shots as they go out the door. Okay. Again, I've already gone over the sense of self, but I just really want to just remind you, this is a really important concept. Who you are and what do you stand for? Okay. If you want to just even be briefer, don't let people define who you are. Okay. Know yourself. So when people say that's a terrible idea, it's a good idea. And that usually comes with experience. Okay. So let me start with this moral continuum. The first thing we have is we talk about the first moral failure is a moral slip, right? Moral slip is a type of moral failure that results in very small character change. Okay. Examples: white lies to avoid needlessly hurting someone's feelings. The example I give, I tell my wife all the time, she looks really good in new outfits and stuff. And oftentimes I don't really believe that, but I say it anyway. Okay. And I say it to keep the peace and make her feel good. Okay. And there's no sense being needlessly cruel, as I like to say. Just keep the peace, just move on. And we do this all the time. Another example of a moral slip is taking office supplies home for personal use. Oh, I need a pen. I'll take this pen from work home, and then you just leave it there. Okay. We do these kinds of things all the time. Most people would say, yeah, I probably shouldn't be doing that, but I'm going to continue doing it, or I don't feel like it's a big deal to me. Okay. So they can lead to a compromised character, but we don't usually dwell on them. Okay, so we call those moral slips in our theoretical framework. Next, we talk about a moral stain. And a moral stain is a type of moral failure that will yield relatively moderate character change owing to the unjust outcome. Okay, the emergence of the undesired self begins to or slightly threatens the true self. Think of like double standards and hypocrisy that are acknowledged. Okay, so if you, yeah, I know it's a double standard, and and you apologize for that, then you're kind of in the moral stain. Now, if you have moral standards and you're a hypocrite and you don't acknowledge your double standards and your hypocrisy, then you could move quickly into a moral stain or moral injury and moral decay. And I'll talk about those in a second. I think the best example that I have of this, and there's some others, but is from Reverend John Jenkins. Okay, many of you may not know who he is. He's the president at the time. He was president of University of Notre Dame. I don't know if there's any fighting Irish online here, but he attended a Rose Garden event when Amy Barrett was nominated to be on the Supreme Court. And he went to this event, unmasked, social mingling, all of this stuff, after he put in very, very strict antisocial measures at the university they expected all of his students, all of the faculty and staff to adhere to. Okay, and he was called out on it. By the way, this is a beautiful example of a sincere apology, by the way. We struggle with apologies in America, maybe around the world, but this is a good one. I could probably give a lecture on what a good apology looks like. People have actually written about this, but look, I know many of you have read about the White House ceremony I recently attended. Yeah, so he knows people are talking about this. I regret my error of judgment in not wearing a mask during the ceremony and by shaking hands with a number of people in the Rose Garden. And if you'll recall, a lot of people got COVID from that social event. I failed to lead by example. Double standard, hypocrisy. At a time when I asked everyone else to do something, he didn't do it. I especially regret my mistake and the sacrifices made on a daily basis by students adjusting their lives. Okay, so this is a great one. He's not trying to make excuses. Well, it was an important event. I had a faculty member being nominated by the Supreme Court. I was invited by the President of the United States. He didn't give any of those excuses, which most people do in their apologies. They apologize, but then give excuses for their bad behavior. Good apologies don't give excuses. They just accept, look, I shouldn't have done this. I'm sorry. I made demands on you. I didn't. Right? Beautiful, right? He put this in writing to denounce the fact. So this would be an example of a moral stain. But you can see then, how do you recover? Acknowledge, apologize, make amends. Don't do it again. Those are like, well, how do you overcome that? This is how you do it. Okay, it usually starts with an apology. So in a moral stain, a person stands to benefit from their own moral failure. Okay, so who benefited from him going to the White House? He benefited. He didn't have to go. He wanted to go. He thought he would enjoy it. He thought it'd be supported. Okay. There's always this social comparison of an act of injustice. Okay. We are really good as human beings of knowing when something's been just or unjust. Okay. We know when things are fair or not fair. So it does reflect a character flaw that can lead to a stained identity. Okay, it reveals a potential weak spot in a person's character. Okay, in expressing regret, for example, Jenkins, a person acknowledges the perceived distance between the undesired self and the true self. This isn't how I want you to think of me as someone who double standard and is a hypocrite. I want you to think of me as someone who, if I say someone does it, I lead by example. This is what we see in leadership, leading by example. Okay. And one of the things Gene Wing in a novel said, the worst kind of lie is the one you tell to benefit yourself but to hurt others. Okay. I'm not saying that's what Jenkins did in this case, but when you think about lying, what's the worst kind of lie? Are they all lies the same? Again, that's a different talk. But these are things that can impact on your character and can lead to a moral injury. And also your views. This is an example of a view where dad is pushing the kid around in the car. Oh, wow, what a great dad, right? A woman does, a mom. I get no benefit from that. Why is that? These are the biases and our views that drip in. Okay, now let's move to moral injury. I've already defined moral injury. This is just another way of saying it. I always think it's useful to give people lots of different ways of saying the same thing. This is just a different way of saying it. And a moral injury, the example I give is Jacob Chansley's. Now, many of you people may not know him. You know him as the shaman. Here's a picture of him, but here he is in a suit. Not a bad looking guy, right? And he was convicted for his role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And here's what he said. He wrote this letter from jail. Now, people would say, well, did he write it? Did his lawyers write it? I try not to overanalyze things like that. But here's what he said. My time in jail has permitted me to start to reanalyze my life. So he's already convicted. So maybe you're saying, well, he's writing it so he gets an early parole. I don't know. But this is what he wrote. What is important is for me to apologize. Remember, moral failures begin usually with an apology. I deeply regret and I'm sorry I entered the building. I should not have been there, period. I'm sorry for having aroused fear in the hearts of others. So he saw the harm his actions did. This was wrong, period. Please be patient with me and other peaceful people like me who are having a very difficult time piecing together what happened. Okay, to us, around us, and by us. We are good people who care deeply about our country. No excuses, simple apology. Again, nice example. I'll try to give some nice examples of apologies. But this is one of the things that you can see people doing, okay? Now, in a moral injury, a person has a character breakdown owing to an unjust outcome that pertains to one's own suffering and encases the suffering of others. Okay, so somebody else suffered in a moral injury, not just you. Your character suffered. So the injustice is twofold. An insult to your sense of self and the harm you did to someone else. Okay? That's you, and that's usually why they would call that a traumatic event, and you would get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so this is why there's this overlap. The character breakdown in a moral injury yields a broken or disgraced identity. Right? Who does stuff like that? Who deliberately caused harm to someone needlessly? Right? Deliberate harm. So there's this tug of war now going on between the self and the undesired self. That's not who I am. I'm not that person who did that thing. You see this a lot when people make racist comments or do racist actions. I'm not a racist. That's not who I am. People who know me know I'm not like that. How many times do you see that when events like that happen? Okay, that's just an example. There's lots and lots of examples. Now we're moving to moral decay. So we went from a moral slip, right? From a moral slip. Now we're all the way to the end on a moral decay. Okay. And a moral decay reflects continuous acts of moral failure, leading to an altered character and a distorted identity. So the misconceptions and or self-deceptions about what is good. The Stoics have a term for that, amathia, where it's a term where it's a lack of wisdom for what is good for the self and by extension others. That's what parenting is all about. Parenting is all about teaching your kids what is good for themselves and what is good for other people. Don't do that. That's not right, right? That's what parents do. No, they're not consciously thinking, oh, that's amathia, I need to apply this. That's not what they're thinking, but that's what parents do. When a person embraces vice as a virtue, or they devalue virtue as a weakness. Oh, if you're paying all your taxes, you're just stupid. Smart people don't pay taxes. Okay, those kinds of statements. You could speed because there's no police here. Right? So here you're making something that's illegal something that you should encourage people to do. Okay, it's turning vices into virtues, telling the truth, always telling the truth. Okay, we saw the white lies, it can have its impact. So an example, by the way, this is not Vladimir Putin, this is Michael McFaul. He was a U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he claims, because he's known Putin for over 30 years, that he's changed. His character has completely changed. And probably as he got more and more power, became more and more autocratic, more and more dictatorial, his character changed. to where he thought killing people who disagreed with you was okay to do. When McFaul knew him, he said Putin never would have done something like that. But this is how characters can change over time. Okay. Another example is Lance Armstrong. Many of you may not know who Lance Armstrong was. I was a huge Lance Armstrong fan. Huge. He had won 7 Tour de France's. I followed every one of his Tour de France wins. But after around the 4th or 5th win, people started saying he's cheating. Lance Armstrong is cheating. He's taking dope. He's doping up to win these races, to enhance his performance. And when you started looking at the evidence, it was really pretty compelling after his 4th or 5th win. Yeah, this guy is cheating. And in fact, a newspaper in London wrote an article that Lance Armstrong was doping. Lance Armstrong sued that London newspaper. Lance Armstrong won a defamation of character lawsuit against them for like $200,000. Even though he was cheating, and later he did admit he was cheating. So they stripped all of his medals, but said he would do it again because everyone was doing it. Even though there are some writers who said I wasn't doing it. Now, one of the interesting things is he admitted to cheating because his son was in school, and you kids being very cruel to each other. They said, yeah, your dad's a cheater. He took drugs. He's a nobody. You know how kids are. So his son went home and asked him. He said, Dad, did you cheat to win those Tour de France's? And Lance Armstrong said, I could not lie to my kid. So he said, I cheated. But he lied to everybody else. See how these different identities come together? He was the same person. As a cyclist, as a sportsman, as a cancer advocate, lied, but couldn't lie when he put on his hat as a dad. He didn't want his son to say, I can't trust anything my dad says. So you never know how these things will emerge. But this is a really complicated case with Lance Armstrong. I was a huge supporter. I think he's in the moral decay, not realizing, still does not fully realize the harm that his actions did and that he did anything wrong. So, and this from further notes, I get a lot of questions on moral decay, and I just want to say that a moral decay involves an altered character and an altered personality. The person is fundamentally different. They're not the person you knew. This is why sometimes when people do bad things, you'd say, that's not the person I knew. But people change. People change. A person with moral decay sees nothing wrong with their actions or behaviors, even when they result in suffering or death. They see nothing wrong with them. Putin, as an example. Violation of societal norms or values is justified. In philosophy, we say does the means justify the actions? Actions typically only benefit the person or the group, right? So your actions don't benefit anybody else but either you or the group that you're part of. Treatment must focus on addressing the personality here. This isn't post-traumatic stress disorder we're talking about. We're talking about someone's personality has changed and been altered. Groups may also experience moral decay. So groupthink, you can get groupthink coming, right? In moral decay, again, I said this already, vices are viewed as virtues and virtues as vices. Okay, so this is the table. Maybe I should have started with this table, but here's the table. We have a moral slip, then you have moral stain, then you have moral injury, then you have moral decay. So this is the continuum. So moral injury isn't the only type of thing that can be happening. It's the one that's in the popular scientific literature, but we think it's on a continuum, and it's not the worst. We think moral decay is the worst. This just gives you sort of the language we use to talk about the character and the identity, but you can see clearly it's a character identity framework, and then there's lots of examples. Cheating on an exam is another example of a moral stain. So there are lots and lots of examples of moral failure in this continuum. Okay, now this is an exercise that I was going to have you do, but we're just going to do it together instead. So here are 3 events: seeing a fatal car collision, being betrayed by one spouse, soldier kills a young civilian teenager in combat. Okay, you can see lots of events. I'm trying to mix it up to give you lots of examples. So what's the role in the first one? Well, in the first one, you're a witness. And symptoms that are likely affected are going to be biological, psychological, social. Seeing a fatal car accident is one of those things that can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. So you're going to likely get a PTSD, depression. Oh my God, I can't believe I saw that. I can't get it out of my mind. All of those kinds of things. Being betrayed by a spouse. Now, that's not a traumatic event. Now, it's psychologically maybe hurts your feelings, but there's no one who was, you know, severely injured. Nobody died, but you're a victim. I trusted my spouse. This is an example of betrayal, right? Someone betrayed me. That's a moral injury that's likely to emerge from that. Probably if you went to a therapist, you're going to get a diagnosis of depression. No, you're just depressed because your spouse left you. But really, you're having a sense of like, what kind of person am I that my spouse would cheat on? Am I not that lovable? Am I not that likable? Can't people be loyal to me? So you're challenging your sense of self. Soldier kills young civilian teenager in combat. So here you're the perpetrator. And you're going to have biological issues, religious issues, spiritual issues. Why did, was it an accident? What could I have done differently? The second guessing, all of that. And here you're likely to get a diagnosis of PTSD and moral injury. Okay, so I'm sort of setting the stage in these vignettes. When you think about them, you say, well, sometimes it's just traumatic illness you're going to get, PTSD, depression. Sometimes it could just be a moral injury, and sometimes the same event can lead to both. And this is what shaped our theoretical thinking around this. And this is the dual process model. So what the dual process model fundamentally says, you can have an event, and this event, you have a role in it. You can either do or fail to do something. You can either be involved and be part of the suffering and death, or you could just witness it and stand there and watch. Or you could be the victim. Sexual assault, domestic violence, all of those things. There you're a victim, right? You didn't do anything. People did it to you. But the role you have will influence and does influence the symptoms and the process and how that event takes place. So if it's something you did or failed to do, and by the way, failing to act is an action. It's a decision. The research that we've conducted shows they're very similar. If I stand around and watch something bad happen, even though I'm not participating, but I know I should stop it and I don't, that's a decision. And the impact is almost just as bad as those doing the actions. Okay. And in fact, in some of the focus groups conducted by Jonathan Shea of Vietnam veterans, their main concern was, why didn't I speak up? Why didn't I refuse to do this? And the reason is because if they refused to serve in Vietnam or if they deserted, they'd have gotten in trouble and went to jail, and they didn't want to go to jail. Okay. So they said, well, I can't just leave. You can't just leave the military. So they did what they were told to do, but that has implications later. Okay. They said, I shouldn't have done it. I should have refused to do it. Okay. So you get those kinds of reactions sometimes with a moral injury. And the process is more biological, psychological, and social. And that's what these solid lines mean. And those are going to lead more to the traumatic illness pathway. Okay. It's not that the other domain is not impacted. That's what the dotted lines mean, but it's not impacted as much. Now, if you are a witness and a victim, then that can also activate a pathway, but it's more likely to activate the moral injury or character pathway. This is the dual process. Now, I know this seems really complicated. There's boxes and arrows going everywhere, but we want to try to distinguish what pathway are we on, because what pathway you're on will determine the type of intervention and the focus of that intervention. This is why it's important, because what we also saw, and I'll just make a comment about this later, but just say it now, what we see is the current treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, especially for combat veterans, isn't as effective as it is for victims of sexual assault or domestic violence. Now, why is that? Well, this theory would say it's because the role, one was a victim, whereas the other was probably more likely a perpetrator or a witness. Now, in combat, you can have all of them going on at the same time because events happen so chaotically, okay? But if the main problem is a threat to one's sense of self, then we're talking not really post-traumatic stress disorder, but really more of a moral injury. Now, the rest of these slides simply embellish this whole concept, okay? And I basically said it all, so I'll just briefly say this, but you'll have this and you can get the paper if you're more interested. But again, I just want to highlight an event may only activate one pathway, or it can activate both pathways. That's a pretty simple concept, okay? So same event can activate both the traumatic pathway or the moral injury pathway. However, the timeline might be different, okay? By definition, when you have a traumatic event, you'll have an acute stress reaction followed by post-traumatic stress disorder because it's on a time course. So acute stress reaction, immediate to 30 days, the symptoms persist beyond 30 days that lead to an impairment, then that's post-traumatic stress disorder. The moral injury, you could have a moral injury months later when you have time to reflect on your experience. Or it could be during that acute stress reaction phase, okay? But the time courses will be different. The event I already mentioned in combat could be single or multiple. Usually cases of domestic violence or child abuse, there are multiple events, okay? There are multiple events, not a single event. There can be single events or multiple events. The event may result in serious harm or death, or it may not. The event may be acute or chronic. Events may be cumulative. They can accumulate over time. I've already talked about the roles, so I'm not going to beat that up anymore, but do keep in mind there are three principal roles: perpetrator, witness, victim. And they can change. In combat, 1 minute I may be a witness, the next minute somebody may be shooting at me, and then the next time I may just be looking at it, okay? So you can have all of those roles in a very short amount of time, and they can all have a different impact, and they can all accumulate for a different impact, okay? So we often appraise our role, like this is what someone did to me, right? Americans, human beings, are very good at figuring out the wrongs that people have done to them, right? Sometimes people will call this the victim culture. Everyone's a victim, right? Everyone, something's always been something, but they never sort of look at their own role in the event. Like, well, what could you have done to mitigate what happened to you? Or do you just like, nothing, I couldn't have done anything? Many of you may not be familiar with the My Lai massacre that occurred in Vietnam. This is a very classic case in U.S. military atrocities where a platoon leader was ordered to kill every man, woman, and child in a Vietnamese village. Now, there weren't any men in that village of fighting age. They were all old men, but he was ordered to kill all of them. And he told his platoon, all right, open fire on these folks. And half the platoon did. They just killed women, children, old men, but about half the platoon didn't. Half the platoon said, this is wrong, I'm not doing that. So they just watched. The ones who watched also suffered moral injury because they felt they should have done something to stop it. Okay, so just because you refuse an order, if you watch it, you can still be impacted because you think, I should have done something. I think all of us have been in a situation where we've been in an organization where the boss has said something and done something. Somebody speaks up. We don't support that person who speaks up, and then later, I should have supported them. Often when I would speak up in the military, no one else would side with me. But then I get like emails after the meeting saying, oh, great job. Thanks for speaking up. And I'm thinking, that would have been helpful if you'd have said it in the meeting, right? But the idea is somebody can speak up. So at least everyone knows, okay, somebody sees that this isn't right. But it can still have lasting impacts. Okay. And this just really is more of an esoteric set of slides, but I put them in here just for completeness, where we try to distinguish when you will see post-traumatic stress disorder emerge and when you will see post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury emerge, or when you will just see moral injury emerge. I'm not going to go through all of these slides. I've already touched on it earlier, and you can read the paper for more details because I want to make sure I leave time for questions. Keep in mind, it's when these values are transgressed. I talked about military values, but there are other values, your personal values, right? You may say, well, I don't value courage. I value something else, compassion, right? That's not a military value, compassion, by the way. In all of my readings, all the way back to antiquity, no one ever mentions compassion, okay? Never. But doesn't mean it's not important for some occupations. I'd say for like priesthood, being a preacher, I would think that would be a rabbi. Having compassion would be really important. Okay. So I know I'm going through these very quickly, but here's the crux. Understanding the root cause of the symptoms and reactions is critical for determining the treatment or intervention plan. So I spend a lot of time, thinking about how these things are related, going back to the theory, because that will tell us where best to intervene and how best to intervene. I hope that makes sense. So theory tells us where we should intervene, and it also guides us in what that intervention should look like. Okay, so to recap, this is a very short recap here. The character theory of moral injury argues that a moral injury occurs when there's a perceived personal failure to adhere to a virtue or value that results in needless suffering or death that threatens one's character and identity. So you perceive that something that event did something to who you are, how you see yourself, how you want other people to see you. Okay. Moral injury is viewed as a continuum from a moral slip to a moral stain, and from a moral injury to moral decay. So we don't see it just a moral injury. We see there's things that aren't as bad as a moral injury and things that are worse, moral decay. The character theory of moral injury postulates two separate yet interacting domains. I didn't emphasize that, but these domains interact. It's all us. Everything we do interacts with each other. All right. And the illness domain and the character domain, with the former leading to PTSD, the latter to moral injury. Okay. Both may interact to result in dying by suicide. And I'm going to talk about that next. Oh, we got a knowledge check. Oh, quickly, we'll do this quick knowledge check. Which statement best captures the definition of moral injury as viewed within the character domain perspective? A moral injury is a symptom of PTSD. B, a moral injury is a moral failure defined by the perspective of others. A moral injury only occurs when there is death or suffering of others. A moral injury is perceived as a moral failure. Okay, D, right? We know D is the answer because we make a distinction. A moral injury is not PTSD. We say moral injury is a moral failure. It's not defined by others. It's defined by you. You decide that. Now, one of the things I did mention, I probably should have, in a moral decay, if a person has reached moral decay, they are unable usually to self-reflect and see that their thinking and their actions are wrong. That's the only time where an external evaluation is likely required. Okay, so when you get to that moral decay state, you are so unable to see how your actions are not appropriate that it takes somebody else to say something. Okay, all of the statements about the moral failure continuum are correct, except the moral failure continuum consists of slips, stains, injuries, and decay. Well, no, that's right. Moral slips and stains, but not moral injury, require self-reflection. They all do. In a state of moral decay, the individual lacks character and dignity. Maintaining one's character is a lifelong endeavor. D, maintaining one's character is a lifelong endeavor. You don't say, well, I've got character at age 50, now I can do whatever I want. Usually you're called an old curmudgeon or someone like that, right? Where you just start saying and doing whatever you want, right? When I was young, I always wanted to get to that age and be able to do that. But now that I'm at that age, I'm not so keen on doing that anymore. Now, the dual process model states that an event may cause both a moral injury and a mental health disorder, that social and psychological symptoms are more likely to activate both moral injury and PTSD pathways. C, that being a perpetrator is worse than being a victim. D, all the above are correct. Okay, well, that an event may cause both a moral injury. Yep, that's true. That social and psychological symptoms more likely to activate both moral injury. No, I said that these are more likely to activate the PTSD pathway. That being a perpetrator is worse. No, it could be the same. Being a witness, being a bystander, knowing you should act, would be just as bad as being a perpetrator. And in fact, there's thinking going on where if you're a perpetrator, you may more likely be at the moral decay stage, which helps you to become a perpetrator. Okay, so the opposite of that. So the correct answer there is A. Okay. Now, evidence-based interventions for PTSD. I just want to say something. I've already mentioned this earlier, but I'm just going to highlight it here more formally. So, evidence-based therapies for treating post-traumatic stress disorder are numerous. The current ones are CPT, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, known as PE, or EMDR. Okay. Over one half of combat exposed veterans fail to respond to these treatments. Okay, this is in the literature, not work I've done, work other people have done. We would argue the reason why it's not effective is they're not identifying the root cause, i.e., spirituality, character, and identity. Okay, that's testable. You could test that. Okay, there are no gold standards for treating moral injury, so I can say, here's what you need to do. However, self-reflection and self-forgiveness are important elements of that, right? We are human beings. We need to learn to forgive ourselves when we make mistakes, but we need to sincerely try not to repeat the same mistake twice. Okay? Mindfulness and self-compassion are important. Adopting a Stoic philosophy, which, by the way, is based on self-reflection, focusing on those things, living a virtuous life, not causing harm to other people, and interventions grounded in religious and spiritual practice are being tested as I speak, but neither of them have been validated yet. So I just want to highlight that. I've already talked about the Stoic perspective, reflecting. This is Seneca, who says that every night, when the lights go down, although the lights don't go down because they didn't have lights and he turned off the lamp, he would reflect on his day and say, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? Let's not do that again. But don't be afraid to challenge yourself critically, but then forgive yourself, right? There's nothing wrong with challenging yourself, saying, I screwed that up. I should have done this. I should have said that. And just don't do it again, right? And it's not easier said than done because we're humans. We're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. I always tell folks, if you want to know the mistakes I make, just ask my wife. She's got a long list. She'd be happy to share, I'm sure. So again, we have the illness domain and the character domain. They're separate, yet they interact. That just makes that point. There are different symptoms for each of these domains. And these symptoms may be similar, yet with different etiologies. This is the complexity in coming up with a diagnostic criteria, because the same symptoms can manifest themselves, but for different reasons. Okay, and that's what makes it a real challenge. Okay, now I want to show the last 20 minutes or show a moral injury or Before I jump into this, Mary, are there any questions or comments? I meant to stop at the knowledge text and do that. Is there any questions or comments we want to try to address in a, seeing if I can see the comments? No questions?
There aren't any questions currently.
Okay, well then, if there's no questions, please, if you have a question, throw it in there. If you have a comment, throw that in there too. All comments and questions are appreciated. So again, here's our definition. So you probably go, good God, so you'll leave here knowing, okay, moral injury is a perceived failure to adhere to a virtue or value that often results in needless suffering or death that threatens one's character and identity. So it's that pathway. So here it is here, laid out a little differently, but you can see here, when there's a traumatic event, usually that I've already mentioned leads to acute stress reaction. That's a diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which can lead to PTSD, which can lead to depression. And by the way, it's why the comorbidity of PTSD and depression is almost one. It's not one, but it's very, very high. And these combined lead to suicidal ideation, which can lead to dying by suicide. In the character domain, we say this moral and ethical violation of a deeply held personal belief threatens one's identity, which can lead to a moral injury, which can lead to suicidal ideation, which can lead to dying by suicide. So these are two very distinct pathways, but remember, they do overlap. They do intersect. There's an interaction between the two. It's not if you get into one pathway, you can't get over to the other. They influence each other. Okay. This is why PTSD treatment can help a little bit with moral injury, because they interact. And it's also why if we had effective interventions for moral injury, I'd say it would help a little bit with the PTSD symptoms. Okay, because there's an interaction, but it's not going to address the root cause. Now, these are two literature. Now, this link between moral injury and suicide wasn't established by me. This was established in 2016 in a review article called Defining and Assessing Moral Injury, a Syndrome Perspective. This is in 2016, almost 10 years ago. There's this very obvious association between moral injury and dying by suicide. It's a decade-old systematic review, which means there's lots of other people who saw it before that. All right, this is the review of all of those articles. And then there's another one that is focused right on this topic, just a couple of years old now, examining the association between moral injury and suicidal behavior in military populations. Okay, so this link between moral injury and dying by suicide, well established. The link, not necessarily cause, but they're associated. Okay, why is that? Well, we just showed you a theory that tells you why that might be the case. Okay, neither of these papers provided a theoretical rationale for it. So this is all of the findings that we were seeing that were shaping why we need to think about moral injury differently than how we had been. So we all know suicide events are rare. So I just want to highlight that. There are a number of reasons to live. This is why suicides are rare. There's an instinct to live. There's a survival instinct. Okay. We must overcome religious and cultural barriers. There are very, very strong religious and cultural barriers to dying by suicide. There are also cultural variables that can increase the risk of dying by suicide. Okay. Humans are resilient. I can't stress that enough. Human beings are extremely resilient, both physically and psychologically. Okay. And there's a strong belief in many cultures of a better afterlife, which makes the vast majority of the current situations that are unpleasant bearable. Because, look, I know my life is terrible, but I'm going to live a religious life, and then I'm going to go to heaven, then I'm going to have a great life for eternity. Right? That can sustain you. That can sustain momentary setbacks or unbearable suffering or deprivations. Okay, so there's value in all of these in protecting against suicide. I'm going to go through these quickly, but again, you'll have a slide. So we know that Males are more likely to die by suicide than females. It's almost 4 to 5 times higher. There's important age differences. I know we focus on the bottom one, children dying by suicide, but those are really, really rare. The most important group is this 45 to 65 and this 25 to 45 age group. Okay. So, and this 25 to 45, that's the age group you see most veterans at, by the way. So, and I'll show some of that data. So I just think this is useful to put suicides and homicides in perspective. This slide's a bit dated, but the data is still the same going out. There are more deaths by suicide in America than murders. I don't know how many people knew that. That's on this call, but that's been the case for about a decade now. Okay, murder rates really have come down. They look like they've stabilized. More suicides, more people die by suicides. And oh, by the way, more people die by drug overdose. It's like 5 times higher than suicides and murders. Okay, so people die by drug overdose at much, much higher rates than they do by suicide or murder. But suicides are higher than murder rates. Veteran suicides, this slide here cuts off in 2005 to 2018, and these are raw numbers. It's not really the way you should present this, but veteran suicides are a problem in America. And by the way, there looks like an emerging problem in other nations too. Here shows the deaths by suicide among veterans and non-veterans. The top graph is non-veterans. You can see it going up. Look here. The bottom slide here looks like flat as a pancake, right? Doesn't look like there's any change. But when you break it out, there has been a little bump, and there's, so there's concern, right? That, I think everyone's heard, one veteran dies every 22 days or 21 days by suicide, something like that. So it's a huge problem. The military and the VA are very concerned about it for these reasons. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these, but I want you to think when I show you slides of risk factors. Now, risk factors are not causal factors, okay? So let me just emphasize that. Just because a risk factor is another way of saying correlation. Okay, so, I don't want to confuse people. This is not a statistics class, but a risk factor is not a causal factor. Think of them more as a correlation. And what we learn in basic statistics, correlation does not equal causation. Okay? When you look at these risk factors, I want you to think about them. Do these risk factors, or can these risk factors represent a threat to one's sense of identity, one's sense of self? So when you look at mental illness, I'm just going to take this one example. I'm not going to go through all of them, but when you look at mental illness, there are many people who don't want to have a mental illness. They don't want a mental illness, so they won't even go get a diagnosis because they don't want people to diagnose them. Dementia happens a lot too. People who are suffering memory loss will not go in and get a diagnosis of dementia because then they'll have dementia. They don't want dementia, so they don't go in. It doesn't stop it from having dementia, but I never was diagnosed. So, and what impact does that have on one's identity? What is the stigma and the discrimination? How do people look at other people with mental illnesses? I mean, for a long time, if you had depression or any kind of mental illness, you could never be elected to public office because of the stigma of mental illness. We can't trust you. You could have a breakdown in office. We need someone who's strong, right? Mental illness was seen as a sign of weakness. So all of these things, I would argue, impact on one's sense of self, how they see themselves, how they want to see themselves, how they want other people to see them. So these are the individual risk factors. By the way, I got this from Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I didn't generate these. Relationship, all of these, community risk factors, societal risk factors. You can see stigma is called out in societal stigma, help seeking, stigma, mental illness, easy access to weapons. So all of these things facilitate dying by suicide, right? That's why they're called risk factors. They're associated. Bullying. Then there's some protective factors. By the way, I saw like 3 slides of risk factors, only 1 slide of protective factors, but effective coping, reasons for living. I'm talking about that. Strong sense of cultural identity. Yes. Black is beautiful. Gay pride. All of these, whether or not you think blacks are beautiful or whether or not you believe in gay rights, all of these help protect these groups from dying by suicide. If you have pride in your group, that's a protective factor. Okay, so these are positive things in terms of dying by suicide. I would argue that's a good thing. All right. Hope that's not controversial, people living, but relationships, supportive partners. We talked about how you can have a moral injury from a betrayal, perhaps. Community, being connected to your community. So differently, being connected to your neighborhood is important. Reduce access to lethal means. Yeah, we all know that. Culture and religious, I already talked about that. Those are protective factors for dying by suicide. These are the iteology. Etiology means causes. What are the causes? So people say mental illness causes dying by suicide, medications. I showed you the sex data, availability of firearms, life experiences, physical illness. A lot of times people, I don't want to have a physical illness. I don't want to live in chronic pain. I don't want to be a burden on others. And all of those kinds of things can lead to someone taking their life. Poverty is highly associated with dying by suicide as well. So now move a little bit into the Stoics and their view on suicide, which is quite controversial. But we all know that Socrates did what? He died by suicide. He drank hemlock rather than to recant his deeply held intellectual beliefs. Okay, so he said, this is something I'm willing to die for. I'm not sure I feel anything strong about any intellectual belief I have where I would risk my life for. So if someone said, we're going to kill you unless you recant your theory of moral injury, okay, I recant my theory of moral injury, okay? Now, Socrates wouldn't, right? He'd stand on his principles, all right? But I'm just telling you what mine are. Now, Admiral Stockdale, many of you may remember Admiral Stockdale when he ran as vice president on a third party, but he was the longest POW in Vietnam. Almost 8 years, 7.5 years, he was a POW at the famous Hanoi Hilton. And he was eventually released. And he tells this story where he tried to kill himself, right? So Admiral Stockdale, when he was in captivity, he wasn't an admiral then, he was a captain. He tried to kill himself because he couldn't take the torture anymore. And when I heard that, I said, I wonder when they put him in for his Congressional Medal of Honor, if that's mentioned. And it is. It's right here. I took this from the citation of his Medal of Honor. And I said, how did they talk about it? So he deliberately inflicted a near mortal wound. We call that suicide, don't we? Suicide attempt, wouldn't we? He deliberately inflicted a near mortal wound to his person in order to convince his captors of his willingness to give up his life rather than capitulate. It's in the citation. Now, today, I bet you that wouldn't get in the citation. But this was in his citation for his Medal of Honor. You can look it up. All of the Medal of Honor citations are posted on the website. There's a Medal of Honor website. You can go look it up. I just pulled this out. But they acknowledged that he tried to kill himself. But they gave a reason, didn't they? They said because he wanted to convince his captors of his unwillingness to give up his life rather than capitulate. So they're saying, well, in some cases, suicide might be the right act. Really? That's what the Stoics said too, by the way. So, suicide literally means self-murder, right? Suicide is killing oneself. But one could define it differently and say suicide is choosing to die without honor. There are lots of ways to die without honor, but there's lots of ways to die with honor. I just showed you a citation of a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient where they gave an explanation of dying with honor. So it's important to distinguish these two. So here's some examples of dying without honor that people talk about all the time. Escaping responsibility. Jeffrey Epstein would fit in that category. If you don't subscribe to the conspiracy theory, you'd say, well, he just killed himself because he didn't want to be held accountable. He didn't want people to think he was a sexual predator. So he'd rather kill himself than versus face that scrutiny to punish those left behind. Lots of times when you read suicide letters, people say, and I hope you caused me to die. But they'll write that. So they're trying to punish people. Refusing to live a virtuous life, right? So you do it to get out of accepting responsibility. Succumbing to short-term or temporary setbacks. failed relationship, financial crisis. During the Great Depression, we all read stories about people who lost their fortune jumping out of skyscrapers, etc., because, embracing vices as virtues. So the Stoics talked about what they called the open door policy, and they identified 5 reasons when giving up one's life may be suitable. Unbearable pain, I mentioned that. By the way, these are also some of the risk factors and the causal factors that I mentioned earlier. Useless or burden to society. Thomas Joyner's interpersonal psychological theory of suicide says burdensomeness is one of the key factors in someone deciding to die by suicide. But all of these impact on your sense of self and how you want other people to see you. Principled reasons in defense of a cause, personal dignity. I don't want to have a severely debilitating disease that, you lose a sense of dignity, to safeguard others. Okay, so in the military, throwing yourself on a hand grenade, things like that. So here's some examples of would not fit the definition of suicide. Now, most people don't know that suicide is not a mental health disorder. All right. It's now in the current diagnostic and statistical manual way at the back as an other condition to be considered. All right. So they're thinking of adding it, but it's never been a mental health disorder. And all of these things here, you don't have suicidal behavior if you do it to save someone else's life. Like they wouldn't call that a suicidal behavior. If you give up your place on a lifeboat for wounded or women when the ship is sinking, that wouldn't be a suicidal behavior. If you charge the enemy knowing for certain you're going to be dead, that wouldn't be considered suicidal. Or if you're a religious martyr, these are all exceptions to be having in displaying suicidal behavior. Okay, these are all exceptions because there's this recognition, even in the diagnostic and statistical manual, that there are acts that people can engage in that will cost them their life that is not considered suicide. And I would say that is dying with honor. That's what the Stoics would say. These are examples of dying with honor. Now, many of you have heard of the Werther effect. This is the suicide contagion phenomenon. And most people don't know this, that the Werther effect was actually done from reading a book. So you're probably not likely to have this happen today because Americans don't read that much. But this is where Werther died by suicide, and it resulted in glamorizing dying by suicide, right? This is what I think happened. It normalized dying by suicide. And this last point on this side that I want to make is the military suicide prevention efforts may unintentionally promote the Werther effect, not by romanticizing dying by suicide, but by normalizing it. When you normalize something, then it becomes more acceptable. And we don't know if this is happening. This is just me speculating. So I want to be very clear, I'm speculating. But I think how we talk about suicide is really, really important. And we don't want to talk about it in a way that normalizes it. And you see these high suicide rates in the military, you see these high suicide rates among veteran population suicide rates are about 2 times higher, by the way, than non-veterans. That's concerning. That's an alarming increase. And by the way, women who serve in the military rates are 3 to 4 times higher than women who've never served in the military. So you see this cultural effect, this military cultural effect, I will argue, in the military and among veterans, military veterans.
Dr.
So,
Castro,
yes,
there
ma'am.
are a couple of comments on the last slide, the one
Oh,
before the Werther
sure, read them.
effect.
Read them.
So the first one is, it was another example, refusing life-saving medical care.
Absolutely. The do not resuscitate order, right? Those are examples of people saying, I do not want to be in a coma. I do not want to be permanently disabled, debilitated. Highly controversial. I didn't go talk about assisted suicide, those kinds of things, because those are very culturally, those are hot button items, right? Because we have this huge, huge, huge belief in America in prolonging life. And And it even goes further. It's prolonging life and I look good. That's the whole cosmetic surgery thing too, right? So you got to get, I don't want to just live long. I want to live long and look good. And I want to be healthy. We all do. We all want to live as long as we can, be as attractive as we can, and be as healthy as we can. What happens when that doesn't work out that way? And so those are great comments. Those are really good examples. I may use some of those in future talks. I hope that's okay. Then we have suicide by proxy. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Mary, was another question?
So there's another one, refusing invasive medical treatment or even treatment based on religious beliefs
Yep.
against treatment seems not suicide also.
Yep, that's right. Those would be examples that you wouldn't say that's suicide, but it's deliberately resulting in your death. You're making a decision that will result in you dying. Which, by the
And
way, is
there's,
the definition of suicide. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
sorry,
Keep them coming, Mary. Keep them coming.
there is a comment on the Werther effect, kids on social media normalizing suicide.
Yes. Spot on. The whole normalization, and they do think there is some data that indicates that children are more susceptible to the contagion phenomenon than adults. That's not real solid evidence. It's really more case study. But there is the theoretical rationale that young people are more impressionable. They're more susceptible to reacting to bullying. I mentioned that. I didn't elaborate on that, but that's what bullying can do. A lot of people, a lot of people who are victims of bullying are more likely to die by suicide. And you get that really more from looking at the psychological autopsies following suicide. So thank you for those comments. Those are great. So anything else, Mary, before I jump back in? I'm sorry.
That's it for now. I'll let you know if there's more.
Thank you for those comments. So suicide by proxy, it exists, it's real. It's when people, to overcome all of these barriers that I talked about, well, what do? Well, they'll get somebody else to kill them, right? So deliberately exposing yourself to enemy fire without really trying to achieve a military objective, committing crime so the police kill you. There is a literature in the scientific literature on suicide by proxy, specifically police killing, engaging in extreme risk-taking behaviors. I would argue a lot of drug use, illegal substance use is this proxy of I can't take my own life, but I'll do it slowly over time. Some people think, these extreme cases of obesity are examples of that, sort of this slow killing by proxy. I can't take my own life, but I can engage in behaviors that I know are likely to result in significant harm or my death. Okay, so these are, I'm not saying every risk-taking behavior fits that, but these are just examples of where you can sit. Keep it in mind, suicides are really rare events. Of course, there are dangers of the open door. This is why people hate the Stoics' view. Many people hate the Stoics' view on suicide because there's a real danger that someone will take their life for no good reason. We're human beings. We're going to make mistakes. There are going to be cases where that happens, right? Not all decisions are right decisions. We talk about that too. We're not perfect. We're going to make mistakes. However, the power of choice and the power of control is what makes Stoicism a very powerful philosophy. You have the power, you have the control. We call that empowerment in social work and in psychology. But I will empower you to a point to make decisions about yourself, but only to a point, right? Stoics would say it's that power. It's the fact that life is so fleeting that we could die at any moment that gives the whole vitality to life, to live a virtuous life. Okay. So I've already mentioned the active duty suicides. I just want to highlight a point here. The 3 times when service members and veterans are most likely to die by suicide. This isn't known enough, in my opinion. And that is when service members first enter the military. It's when they return home from deployment, and it's when they leave the military. And what do all those things have in common? Well, people join the military because they want to be part of something. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They want to be part of a family, part of a community. And oftentimes they're rejected when they join. When people deploy, things go bad at home. But they think once they get back at home, things will be better, and they're not. And that's why they die by suicide. People who leave the military, they're going to have to start a whole new career, and they think it's going to be better. Their life is going to be great, and it's not. And that places them at increased risk. So there are things that we can do at each of these points to sort of address that. So I've already mentioned this. Well, no, I haven't mentioned this. 80 to 90% of active duty suicides have occurred within 1 year or less of the service member seeing behavioral health. Most people don't know that. So what do? Get them to behavioral health. But you go to behavioral health and they go, yeah, but they don't have a mental health disorder. But they may have a threat to their identity, their sense of self, their sense of belonging, how they see themselves. Approximately 70% of elderly veterans who die by suicide have been to behavioral health within the last 90 days. So getting to behavioral health isn't going to take this suicide rate to zero. And by the way, effective treatments for suicide are very elusive. It's hard. None of the military suicide prevention efforts have been shown to be effective. Neither have any of the ones in the VA. Neither have any ones that are used in the non-veteran population, non-military population. So we really lack really good, effective intervention. A lot of people are working on them, lots of promises. So let me just say the U.S. military and veteran prevention strategy takes this approach. All suicides are preventable. All suicides involve mental and behavioral health issues. All suicides are preceded by warning signs. Suicides can be prevented through continuous training and awareness, focusing on knowing these signs. All service members and veterans are equal risk. I just showed you that you're different risk in the military life cycle, but everyone gets the same training once a year, no matter how much at risk they are. When suicides happen, leaders and unit members or family members are often blamed. They're saying, you should have detected this. What kind of leader are you? What kind of spouse are you that you couldn't detect that your spouse was having problems? Behavioral health personnel know how to effectively treat and support. These are all assumptions. Most of them are incorrect, or there's no data to support them. Okay, so if you have a strategy that's flawed, how do you think it's going to lower the suicide rates? And I just showed you the data. They're not lower. In fact, I think they're going up. I think we need to face some very unpleasant facts. We need knowledge that the military's current impairment approach is not working. It hasn't worked for 30 years. It's not likely to work. I've been in this space for 40 years. It's not working. We need to embrace the fact that service member veterans have the power to decide how they live and how they die. We may not like that fact, but that's a fact. We need just to accept it. Know that every service member veteran who's considering dying by suicide, or not every member who's thinking of dying by suicide, has a mental health disorder. They could have a moral injury, right? That's not in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Recognize that moral failure contributes or may contribute. I'm saying does contribute. I only showed you the systematic reviews that are highly, highly suggestive. Okay, highly suggestive. Except that many soldiers will experience dark moments in their lives. And if you experience a dark moment, what are those dark moments and what can we do about them? Well, here's some dark moments. One's a moral failure to uphold a deeply held moral belief. What do we tell people to do when that happens? We don't give any training on this. Experiencing intense physical pain. Existential. Others believe you'd be better off if you never existed. That you're different. Remember I mentioned black pride or black is beautiful, gay pride. This is awareness that you're different, but in a positive way, right? Instead of saying, oh, I'm different, I need to die by. LGBT individuals are more likely to die by suicide than non-LGBT individuals because of how they're treated. Society, right? The stigma. Not 100%, it's changing, I think, for the better. Realization that you despise who you are. right? This is sense of self. I can't stand myself. Social rejection, failed marriages, not being accepted into the military culture, those kinds of things. Insurmountable debt, crime. All of these are risk factors, but we all at some point are rejected. I think maybe everyone has had a failed personal relationship with someone, but most people don't die. They get over it. They may mope around, but then they get better and they go on, have other relationships, get married, have families, etc. So dark moments is an event or experience that challenges one's sense of self. This is how I define a dark moment sort of operationally. And I've already showed you this slide before, right? Because it compromises who you think you are, how you feel about yourself. You care about what other people say. We do. We're human beings. We're social. We need social acceptance. But do you need everybody's acceptance, right? Is everybody's opinion important to you? There's lots of quotes saying that if everybody speaks well of you, that means you've never stood for anything. I don't know if you've all seen that quote, right? In other words, you should have done something somewhere, someplace where people don't like you. And if you haven't, then you haven't pushed your own self. All right. Now I know there's some people saying, I've never once ever said anything negative about this person. So here's what we need to do. We need to empower service members, and I'd say everybody needs to be empowered by instilling and reminding them of their virtues and values. And this is true for every profession, by the way. We need for everyone to have a sense of living with honor, even when they're experiencing their darkest moments. We've got to support each other. We need to embrace diversity through team building. We need to enable every serviceman veteran to derive meaning from their military service. So this slide here, of course, was done to help the military, but you need to feel proud of what you accomplished. Being in a healthcare providers, they should feel proud of what they're doing. Does that mean they're not going to make mistakes? No. Does that mean they're going to save everybody? No. But they still need to have this sense, you did your best, right? Remember the continuous growth that we talk about, always trying to be better. And then we need to prepare everybody for these dark moments. What happens when somebody bullies you? What happens when you're rejected? What happens when you have setbacks in life? We all have setbacks. We can prepare people for setbacks. Parents aren't always going to be there to protect their kids, right? Sometimes you get out there and figure it out on your own and you'll fail, but you'll learn from that and move on. So I say you got to abolish the blame game. And we do a lot of blaming. We like to blame people when things happen. You hear this in politics, blame the blame game. Well, sometimes people are to blame. All right. I'm not saying you don't do after action reviews and figure out what went wrong, but that's not going to move you forward. Remember, the Stoics, you focus on what you can control and you focus on the future. Okay. Recognize moral failures as temporary. Most of these moral failures that I talked about are temporary. Accept honest. We hear this all the time in the military. I accept honest mistakes. Well, we also need to accept dishonest mistakes. People are going to make mistakes because they're selfish. They're going to do the wrong thing because they're selfish, and good leaders accept both. All right. Not the ones that cause people to die, though, not that cause permanent suffering. But when people do selfish things, you say, look, you're being selfish. Don't do that again. But as a leader, we have to mentor, especially younger people, right, to move forward. View moral failures as an injury to one's character, requiring moral-based interventions. I already beat that up. And develop a team approach. Sometimes these moral failures we have is parents can fix them, mentors can fix them, supervise, colleagues. Hey, stop that. That's not right. Okay. Chaplains, huge, many more chaplains in the world than there are behavioral health care providers, right? No, those are kind of last, right? But chaplains have an important role in this whole thing. So this is just a slide showing you the difference between the approaches. I would say that the current model is focused on pathology. We blame others. We do training that check the box. It's identifying, it's a one size fits all, etc. Whereas the Stoic approach is strength based. It builds character. It's focused on building character. It values life with honor. It's tailored to where the individual is. It emphasizes cohesion and mentoring, and it's outcome focused. So, we need a lot more work. Basically, we need to validate all of our efforts we're doing. Consider integrating a stoic approach. When interventions work, we need to really enhance their effectiveness. Consider the social determinants as well as the individual factors in suicide. You saw some of those protective factors earlier. We have to be patient. We're not going to solve this overnight, but we need to move out with a sense of urgency. So I often get asked, well, can you develop character? Yes, the military has a character development program. I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are programs where you can enforce and develop character. You can they have character programs for school administrators and teachers. This is one focus on military veteran transition. This is a crazy graph, but anyway, I just pulled it from their website. It does look like a pretty good program. I don't think you need to know all of these things, but you can target things. Ethical fitness, corporations, governments. Here, look at the values, right? Remember I mentioned everybody has values: honest, truthful, responsible, fair. We have them, okay? So one can suffer from moral injury without a mental illness. That's the point I want to make home. And then a very last point, a person of character can suffer moral injury, but not moral decay. So you only get to that moral decay bit when you don't have a character or your character is so compromised. I've already mentioned all of the types of interventions and how you can focus on them. This just summarizes that. We need a lot more research. I know, well, we expect a researcher to say that, but we do need more research because we want evidence-based interventions. We want evidence-based interventions. So I know I'm really out of time. I've got like 2 minutes, but here, I know I went through those last slides a bit quick, but you'll have them. You can look at them. Here's my email. Please, comments, questions, feel free to email me at any time. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And I guess I have like 1 minute and a bit for questions. So I hope you found that enjoyable. I know towards the end, it got a bit hectic on the speed, but sorry about that. So anyway, thank you all so much for staying with me for 2 hours. I really do appreciate that. Well, thank you for that heart. I love those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castro. What an incredible presentation. And if someone has a question, put it in the chat. We'll try and grab it in between the thank yous. I just want you to know that I put the survey link in the chat. I'll send you an email within the next hour with the survey link and the slides. And I'm sure you're going to want to be able to refer back to those slides. And if you need to check for your CEU requirements, look at your reminder email or your registration confirmation. Eden will put the Empower Idaho email in the chat. If you have any questions, direct them to that email. And the slides and the recording will be on the website in a couple of days. You got a couple of days to finish the survey, but because of the holiday weekend, you have until Tuesday. So get it done early so you remember, and don't expect those certificates for 14 business days. I don't know if I don't think I noticed any questions in there.
I don't see any either, Mary, but I see a lot of thank yous, and thank you for the thank yous. I really appreciate that. And again, if there's anything I can ever do or add anything, my email is on there. Feel free to email me. I live on email. So I hope you all enjoyed this or it found 1 or 2 things that was informative and it wasn't a complete waste of your time. But thank you all so much for joining me today.
Thank you again. What a great presentation. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.